The bus rattled to a stop at the edge of Millfield, Indiana, releasing a cloud of exhaust into the crisp October air. Pierre Jackson was the only passenger to descend onto the cracked sidewalk, his leather suitcase clutched firmly in one hand. At 28, he carried himself with the cautious demeanor of someone much older, eyes constantly scanning his surroundings as if expecting trouble. His dark hair, cut short on the sides in the fashion of the day, ruffled slightly in the autumn breeze as he surveyed the small town he hadn't seen in 10 years. Millfield looked frozen in time, the same weathered storefronts along Main Street, the same courthouse with its imposing clock tower, the same suspicious glances from locals who recognized him as Austin Jackson's boy, despite his decade-long absence. The town square had changed little, but Pierre had transformed entirely since he'd left at 18. The frightened, confused teenager had become a skilled mechanic in Detroit, a man who understood how to take broken things apart and reassemble them into working order. He'd built a life for himself far from Indiana's cornfields and the suffocating weight of unspoken family history. But his father's letter, arriving unexpectedly 3 weeks ago, had pulled him back with its trembling handwriting and cryptic message. "Time has come to settle accounts. You deserve to know the truth about our name. Please come home." The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, as if Austin had written it long ago, but only recently found the courage to send it. Pierre adjusted his grip on his suitcase and began walking toward Johnston's general store, where he hoped to find someone willing to drive him out to the Jackson farm. The 4-mile journey would be grueling on foot, especially with the gray clouds threatening rain overhead. A bell jangled as he pushed open the door, and the familiar scent of coffee, tobacco, and penny candy enveloped him like a half-forgotten dream. Behind the counter stood old Mr. Johnston himself, bolder and more stooped than Pierre remembered, but with the same sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Pierre Jackson," the shopkeeper stated flatly, neither a question nor a welcome. "Heard you might be coming back. Your daddy mentioned it last time he was in for supplies." "Mr. Johnston," Pierre nodded politely, setting his suitcase down. "I was hoping someone might be heading out toward our place who wouldn't mind giving me a lift." The word "our" felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't considered the Jackson farm his home for a long time. Mr. Johnston studied him for a moment before calling toward the back room. "Frank, that delivery to the Willis place still waiting? Might as well take the Jackson boy out to his daddy's farm while you're at it." A grunt of acknowledgement came from the storeroom, and minutes later, Frank Johnston, presumably the old man's son, emerged wiping his hands on a rag. He was a broad-shouldered man about Pierre's age, with a face that suggested he rarely smiled. "I remember you," Frank said, as they loaded Pierre's suitcase into the back of a rusted pickup truck. "You were 2 grades ahead of me in school, left town right after graduation." His tone carried neither judgment nor curiosity, merely stating facts. Pierre nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. "That's right. Been working in Detroit since then. Auto mechanic." The truck's engine protested before catching, and soon they were rattling down the main road out of town, surrounded by endless fields of harvested cornstalks, golden brown and brittle in the late autumn sunlight. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably until Frank finally spoke. "Folks still talk about your family, you know. Not to your daddy's face, of course, but they remember." Pierre's muscles tensed involuntarily. "What exactly do they remember, Frank?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice casual. Frank's eyes remained fixed on the road, hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Not my place to say. Just thought you should know not much changes in a town like this. Memory runs long." Pierre turned to look out the window, watching familiar landmarks slide past. The old Henderson barn, with its faded mail-pouch tobacco advertisement, the rusted tractor permanently settled at the curve in Miller's Creek, the white steeple of Millfield Baptist Church piercing the gray sky like an accusation. Each sight tugged at something deep within him, memories both comforting and disturbing swirling together. As they approached the long gravel driveway leading to the Jackson farm, Pierre felt his heart rate quicken. The 2-story farmhouse came into view, its white paint grayed with age and weather, standing defiant against the backdrop of bare trees. The barn leaned slightly to one side, more dramatically than he remembered, and the fields that had once grown corn and soybeans lay fallow, overtaken by weeds and wild grasses. Frank pulled up to the front of the house and cut the engine. "Here you are, home sweet home." The words carried a hint of something, irony perhaps, or pity, that made Pierre's skin crawl. He thanked Frank for the ride, retrieved his suitcase, and stood watching as the truck reversed and disappeared down the driveway, leaving him alone with the house and all it contained. The front porch steps creaked under his weight, a sound so achingly familiar that Pierre was momentarily transported to his childhood, running up these same steps after school, his mother's voice calling from inside, his father's weathered hands ruffling his hair. But his mother was 10 years gone now, buried in the Millfield cemetery after a pneumonia that had taken her too quickly, and the man who waited inside was a stranger in many ways, despite their shared blood. Pierre raised his hand to knock, but hesitated, suddenly unsure of his welcome despite the letter. Before he could decide, the door swung open, revealing Austin Jackson, aged beyond his 63 years, standing in the shadowed hallway. "You came," his father said simply, his voice rougher than Pierre remembered. Austin Jackson had once been a tall, imposing man, but age and solitude had diminished him. His shoulders curved inward, his once thick hair now sparse and completely grey, his face lined with deep creases that spoke of hardship rather than laughter. Only his eyes remained unchanged, the same piercing blue that Pierre saw each morning in his own reflection. "I said I would," Pierre replied, equally simple. They regarded each other for a long moment, 10 years of silence hanging between them like an invisible wall, before Austin stepped back, wordlessly inviting his son inside. The house smelled musty, with undertones of coffee, wood smoke, and something else Pierre couldn't quite identify, a faint, acrid scent that tugged at his memory. Inside, the farmhouse was both familiar and foreign. The same worn furniture occupied the living room, the same faded curtains hung at the windows, but everything seemed smaller, shabbier, as if the house itself had been slowly surrendering to entropy during Pierre's absence. Framed photographs lined the mantelpiece, generations of Jacksons staring solemnly at the camera, their eyes holding secrets across time. Conspicuously absent was any picture of Pierre's mother, Margaret, though he knew they had existed once. "Your room's still upstairs," Austin said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Hasn't been touched much since you left. Might want to air it out some." Pierre nodded, suddenly eager to escape the stifling atmosphere of the living room. "I'll do that. Then maybe we can talk about your letter?" Austin's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Got some stew on the stove for supper. We'll talk after we eat." His tone made it clear the subject was closed for now. Pierre carried his suitcase upstairs, each step bringing forth another memory, chasing his cousin David up and down during summer visits, sliding down the banister when his parents weren't looking, hiding on the landing to eavesdrop on adult conversations he wasn't meant to hear. His bedroom door stuck slightly, requiring a firm push to open, revealing a space frozen in time. The narrow bed with its blue-striped quilt, the desk where he'd struggled through homework, the bookshelf filled with adventure novels and science textbooks, all preserved as if awaiting his return. But a fine layer of dust covered everything, and the air felt stale, untouched. Pierre set his suitcase on the bed and moved to open the window, wrestling briefly with the swollen wood before it yielded. Cool autumn air rushed in, bringing with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant smoke. From this vantage point, he could see most of the farm, the barn with its sagging roof, the equipment shed where his father had taught him to repair tractors, the edge of the north field where the land dipped toward a small creek, and beyond that, barely visible through the trees, the old family cemetery where generations of Jacksons rested. As a child, he'd been forbidden to play there, the small plot surrounded by a wrought iron fence and an air of solemn mystery. Now as he stared at the distant headstones, Pierre felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. Something was buried in the Jackson family history, something his father had finally decided he should know. Dinner was a quiet affair, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional creak of the old farmhouse settling. The beef stew was hearty but bland, typical of Austin Jackson's bachelor cooking, functional rather than flavorful. Pierre observed his father across the kitchen table, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes rarely met his son's, the tension that seemed to radiate from his hunched shoulders. Austin had always been a man of few words, but this silence felt different, pregnant with unspoken thoughts, heavy with the weight of what was to come. When they had finished eating, Austin rose stiffly and moved to the sideboard, returning with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Reckon we could both use this," he said, pouring generous measures and sliding one across to Pierre. "Your letter said it was time I knew the truth," Pierre began, deciding directness was the only approach that might work with his father. "About our name. About what happened." Austin took a long swallow of whiskey, closing his eyes briefly as it burned down his throat. When he opened them again, they held a weariness that seemed bottomless. "Not sure where to start," he admitted. "Been carrying this so long, it's grown roots inside me." He traced the rim of his glass with a calloused finger. "Might be easier if you tell me what you remember, what you think you know about our family." Pierre considered this, sifting through childhood memories, trying to separate actual events from impressions and overheard whispers. "I remember how people looked at us in town," Pierre said slowly. "Not at me so much, but at you and grandfather, like there was something shameful, something they knew that I didn't. I remember Cousin David saying once that Jackson wasn't always our name, but when I asked Mother about it, she told me he was making up stories." He paused, recalling more. "And there was that time when I was about 9, when Mr. Whitman at the feed store refused to serve you, and you came home white-faced with anger. You and Mother argued that night. I couldn't hear what about, but she was crying. After that, we started driving to Lawrenceville for supplies instead." Austin nodded, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but remained silent, waiting for more. Pierre took a sip of whiskey, the amber liquid warming him against memories that had long chilled him. "The cellar door was always locked. I found the key once, when I was 13, but when I tried to go down there, you caught me. I'd never seen you so angry before. You grabbed my arm so hard it bruised." His voice grew quieter. "And then there was the fire, the one no one ever talked about, but that everyone seemed to remember. I found a newspaper clipping once in Mother's sewing box. It mentioned a fire at the Jackson farm in 1920, but when I asked about it, she took the clipping away and told me it wasn't something children should worry about." Austin's face had grown increasingly pale as Pierre spoke, his hands now visibly shaking as he refilled his glass. "That fire," Austin said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "That's where it all begins, I suppose, or where it changed, at least." He rose from the table abruptly. "Come with me." Pierre followed his father into the living room, where Austin knelt with some difficulty before an old oak chest that had sat untouched in the corner for as long as Pierre could remember. From his pocket, Austin produced a small key and unlocked the chest, lifting the lid to reveal stacks of yellowed papers, old photographs, and what appeared to be journals bound in cracked leather. "Your grandfather, my father, kept records of everything. Maybe too much. Been keeping them locked away since he died, trying to decide whether to burn the lot or—" He glanced up at Pierre. "Or pass them on. Guess I finally made my choice." Austin handed Pierre a leather-bound journal dated 1919 to 1920. "Start with this one. It'll tell you how we became the Jacksons." With that cryptic statement, he retreated to his armchair by the cold fireplace, nursing his whiskey as Pierre settled on the sofa with the journal. The handwriting inside was tight and precise, the words of a man who valued control and clarity. It began conventionally enough, records of crop yields, weather patterns, purchases and sales, typical of a farming operation. But as Pierre turned the pages, the entries became more personal, more troubled. November 17th, 1919. The threats continue. H claims he will expose everything unless payment is increased. Cannot afford more, but cannot afford exposure either. Elizabeth says we should leave, start fresh somewhere no one knows our connection. Perhaps she is right. Pierre looked up at his father, questions forming, but Austin merely gestured for him to continue reading. December 3rd, 1919. Meeting with Mr. Jackson today. He is willing to sell his farm and move west, health being poor. Says he has no family to consider. Offered a fair price, though less than the land is worth. He did not haggle. Elizabeth thinks we could take his name when we move. A clean break. I am considering it. though the deceit troubles me. Pierre's heart began to beat faster as the implications became clear. Jackson wasn't their original name. They had purchased it along with this farm from a man willing to disappear. But why? What were they running from? The journal entries grew increasingly agitated as winter deepened into 1920. References to H appeared frequently, clearly someone threatening the family with exposure of some secret grave, enough to make them contemplate abandoning their identity. January 15th, 1920. H. Who came to the house today? Elizabeth and the children were thankfully in town. Words were exchanged, then blows. I fear I may have injured him seriously. He swore vengeance as he departed, blood streaming from his face. We must accelerate our plans. Pierre felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty farmhouse. Violence, threats, secrets. What kind of legacy had been handed down through his family line? He glanced at his father, who sat motionless, eyes fixed on some middle distance, lost in memories. The journal's most disturbing entry came on February 28, 1920. It is done. The fire has erased our past. We leave tomorrow for the Jackson farm, to begin anew with borrowed names and fabricated histories. I pray the flames consumed all evidence, that nothing remains to connect us to what happened. The children are too young to remember clearly. For them, we will have always been the Jacksons of Millfield. Only Elizabeth and I will carry the full weight of knowledge, the burden of necessary sins. Pierre closed the journal slowly, struggling to process what he had read. The fire, he said, breaking the long silence. It wasn't at this farm, was it? It was at your original home, wherever that was, before you became the Jacksons. Austin nodded, finally meeting his son's gaze directly. We lived in Parkerville then, about 40 miles east of here. Nothing left of our house now, just an overgrown foundation in a field that got sold off decades ago. He took another sip of whiskey. I was 5 when we moved here. Young enough that I grew up thinking Jackson was always our name, that this was always our farm. My father, your grandfather, never intended for me to know the truth. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in small town. Pierre leaned forward, arms resting on his knees. What were you running from? What was so terrible that grandfather had to erase your entire family history? Austin's face contorted briefly with what might have been pain, or perhaps simply the effort of dredging up long-buried memories. That's the part I'm not entirely sure of myself. My father never told me outright, said it was better I didn't know the specifics. But over the years, I pieced together bits from things overheard, from my mother's occasional slips when she'd had too much elderberry wine, from the way certain names would make my father's face go white. He set his empty glass down carefully. What I do know is that it involved money that wasn't rightfully ours, and a man named Harrison who knew enough to ruin my father if the truth came out. The fire was meant to destroy evidence. Papers, I think, though I don't know what kind. But that's not all, Pierre prompted, sensing his father was still holding back. Austin shook his head slowly. No, there's worse. Something happened the night of the fire. Something that wasn't planned. He gestured toward the chest. It's in there, in the later journals. I can't bring myself to say it aloud, even after all these years. Pierre returned to the chest and found a journal marked 1930-1931, much thinner than the first, its pages less filled with daily records and more with what appeared to be confessional writing, as if the author were unburdening himself to the blank page. What he read there made his blood run cold, not because of its explicit horror, but because of what it suggested between carefully written lines. March 15th, 1931. The dreams continue, 11 years on. Always the same, the crackle of flames, the smell of smoke, and then the cry from within the house that should have been empty. Elizabeth still insists we checked every room, that no one could have been inside. But if that is true, whose voice did I hear calling for help as we watched from the safety of the trees? And why, when Sheriff Mills investigated the ruins, did he give me that long, searching look, as if he could see the guilt written on my soul? No body was ever found, yet I cannot shake the feeling that someone perished in our attempt to erase ourselves, an innocent caught in our web of deception. The implications were devastating. Pierre's grandfather had set fire to their family home to destroy evidence of some financial crime. but in doing so, they may have inadvertently caused someone's death. The family secret was not just fraud or theft, but possibly manslaughter, the ultimate price of their fresh start as the Jacksons. Pierre looked up to find his father watching him intently, gauging his reaction. "Do you know who might have been in the house?" Pierre asked quietly. Austin shook his head. "Never knew for certain. My father suspected it might have been Harrison himself, coming to search for the papers he was threatening them about. But it could have been anyone, a drifter seeking shelter, a neighbor checking on the property, not knowing. That was part of my father's punishment. He lived with that uncertainty until the day he died. And now it's your burden," Pierre said, understanding dawning, "and you're deciding whether to make it mine as well." Austin's weathered face crumpled slightly. "I never wanted this for you, son. It's why I didn't fight harder when you left after high school. Thought maybe if you built a life far from here, you could escape the shadow that's hung over us for generations. But lately," he gestured vaguely at his own aging body, "been feeling my years. Didn't seem right to take this knowledge to my grave, to leave you wondering like I did. You deserve to know what name you would have been born with, what history flows in your veins, even if it's a history soaked in shame." Pierre slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with flames and faceless figures fleeing into darkness. He woke before dawn, the farmhouse silent around him save for the occasional creaking of timbers contracting in the pre-morning chill. Lying in his childhood bed, staring at the familiar water stain on the ceiling that had always reminded him of a galloping horse, he tried to reconcile this new knowledge with his understanding of himself. He was not by birth a Jackson. The name that had defined him for 28 years was an artifice, a shelter built from someone else's discarded identity. And somewhere in his family's original history, a history he still didn't fully know, lay a crime serious enough to warrant such extreme measures of concealment, possibly even an accidental death. When he finally rose and dressed, Pierre found his father already at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window at the gradually lightening sky. Austin acknowledged his son with a slight nod, but didn't speak, seemingly content to let Pierre process everything at his own pace. After pouring himself coffee from the percolator on the stove, Pierre joined him at the table. "I need to know our real name," he said finally. "The one grandfather abandoned." Austin's hands tightened around his mug. "Keller," he said, the word emerging with difficulty, as if he rarely spoke it even in the privacy of his own thoughts. "We were the Kellers of Parkerville. My father was Edmund Keller, my mother Elizabeth Keller, née Thornton. I was born Austin Keller, and would have remained so if not for the fire." "Keller," Pierre repeated, testing the sound of it. A German name, likely from ancestors who had immigrated to the Midwest decades or even a century earlier. It felt foreign on his tongue, yet simultaneously resonated with something deep within him. A forgotten chord suddenly struck. Were there other Kellers in the area? Relatives who would have known what happened to us? Austin shook his head. "My father was an only child, and his parents had already passed when I was born. My mother had a sister in Pennsylvania, but they weren't close. After the incident, she cut all ties, said it was safer that way." He took a sip of coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. "As far as I know, you and I are the last of the line, whatever name we use." Pierre considered this, the strange loneliness of being the end point of a family history deliberately obscured. "What about the original crime? Do you know what grandfather did that required such drastic measures to conceal?" Austin's expression darkened. "Not specifically. Those details weren't in the journals. I suspect my father was too cautious to commit them to paper, even in what he considered a secure record. But from things my mother let slip over the years, I gathered it had to do with money that came into his possession dishonestly, a significant amount, enough to purchase this farm outright when they fled Parkerville." He hesitated, then added reluctantly, "I believe it may have involved the bank where he worked as a clerk, perhaps embezzlement or some kind of fraud." The pieces were beginning to fit together in Pierre's mind. A bank clerk, with access to funds, a mysterious windfall, threats of exposure from someone who knew the truth. But there were still gaps in the narrative, crucial missing elements. And Harrison, the man who was threatening grandfather? Austin rubbed his forehead wearily. A colleague from the bank, I believe. Someone who discovered what my father had done and saw an opportunity for blackmail rather than justice. In the later journals, my father sometimes referred to blood money. I think he was paying Harrison regularly until he could no longer afford to, or until Harrison demanded more than he could provide. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of these revelations heavy between them. Then Pierre asked the question that had been gnawing at him since he'd read the journal entries about the fire. "Do you think grandfather really killed someone that night, even accidentally?" Austin's face contorted briefly with pain. "I don't know," he admitted. "For years I told myself it was just his guilt talking, that the house had been empty, that the voice he thought he heard was just the wind or his own conscience. But the way it haunted him until his dying day, the way my mother would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares she refused to describe," he shook his head slowly. "I fear there may have been someone in that house. And if so, their death has been part of our family's burden all these years, a ghost we've never properly laid to rest." After breakfast, Pierre found himself drawn to the family plot at the edge of the property. The small cemetery, enclosed by its wrought iron fence with a gate that creaked in protest when opened, contained the graves of generations of Jacksons, the real Jacksons who had owned this land before his grandfather purchased both property and identity. The oldest headstones dated back to the 1840s, weathered limestone markers with inscriptions barely legible after decades of rain and frost. Near the center stood his grandparents' graves, Edmund and Elizabeth Jackson, their fabricated identity preserved even in death, and beside them the more recent marker for his mother, Margaret Jackson, who had gone to her grave maintaining the family fiction. As Pierre stood contemplating these monuments to a carefully constructed lie, he noticed something unusual at the far corner of the plot. Partially hidden by overgrown grass and a gnarled old rosebush was what appeared to be a small, unmarked stone. Curious, he made his way carefully between the graves until he reached it. The stone was crude compared to the others, lacking any inscription or dates, just a rough piece of limestone about the size of a loaf of bread, deliberately placed but anonymous. Pierre felt a chill run through him as he stared at this mysterious marker. Who would be buried in a family plot without name or dates? And why had he never noticed this stone during his childhood explorations of the property? When Pierre returned to the house, he found his father in the parlor, sorting through more of the documents from the oak chest. "There's an unmarked grave in the family plot," he said without preamble, "at the far corner, almost hidden by the old rosebush. Do you know whose it is?" Austin's hands froze in the act of turning a page, his face suddenly ashen. For a moment, Pierre thought his father might deny knowledge of the grave, but then Austin's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I wondered if you'd notice that," he said quietly. "It's not a real grave, not in the sense that anyone's buried there. My father placed that stone there in 1932 after he received word that Harrison had been found dead in a Chicago boarding house. Heart failure, according to the letter that came from Harrison's sister. A memorial for his blackmailer?" Pierre asked, confused. Austin shook his head slowly. "Not a memorial, a marker of guilt. My father was convinced that Harrison had been in our house the night of the fire, that he had come looking for certain papers and been trapped when the flames spread faster than expected. The discovery of Harrison's body years later, identifiable and certainly not burned in any fire, should have relieved that specific fear. But by then, the guilt had become such a part of my father that he needed some tangible representation of it. So he placed that stone, not for Harrison specifically, but for whoever might have died that night, unnamed and unclaimed." Pierre sank into an armchair, trying to process this new information. "So we still don't know if anyone actually died in that fire," he said finally. Austin spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "We don't. The house was isolated enough that a body could have been overlooked in the ruins, especially if the searchers weren't being particularly thorough. Or my father could have been mistaken about what he heard. Grief and guilt can play tricks on the mind, make us believe things that aren't real." He paused, then added quietly, "But real or imagined, that guilt shaped our family for generations. It's why my father was so stern, so closed off, why my mother turned to religion so fervently in her later years, why I—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Why you pushed me away, Pierre finished for him. Why you were always distant, always watching me as if waiting for some sign of corruption to manifest. The realization brought with it a flood of memories, his father's persistent emotional absence, the rare moments of connection always curtailed, as if Austin feared allowing himself to love his son too openly. You were afraid I'd inherit more than just the Keller blood, that I'd somehow inherit the guilt as well. Austin didn't deny it, his silence confirmation enough. Pierre felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at being kept at arm's length for crimes he hadn't committed, pity for the man who had carried this burden alone for so long, and a strange, unexpected relief at finally understanding the tension that had always existed between them. "There's something else you should see," Austin said after a long moment, retrieving a small box from the bottom of the chest. "Something I found after my father died, hidden beneath a floorboard in his bedroom." He handed the box to Pierre, who opened it carefully to reveal a stack of banknotes. Old currency, the paper yellowed with age, and beneath them a folded document that proved to be a deed in the name of Edmund Keller for a plot of land in Parkerville. "The money that started it all," Austin explained. "Whatever my father did to obtain it, this is what remained after purchasing the Jackson farm and identity. He never spent it, never touched it, kept it as a reminder, I suppose, of the cost of his actions." Pierre handled the old money carefully, thinking of how these seemingly innocent pieces of paper had set in motion events that would reshape his family for generations. The total sum wasn't particularly impressive by 1958 standards, perhaps a few $1,000s, but in 1920 it would have represented a significant amount, enough to buy a farm outright and still have some remaining. "What do you want me to do with this?" he asked his father. Austin's response was immediate, as if he'd been considering the question for years. "I want you to make it right, somehow. Not by returning the money. There's no way to know where it came from originally, and too much time has passed, but by using it for something good, something that might balance the scales a little. I've carried this knowledge for too long without action. Maybe you can find a better way." The responsibility felt enormous, a tangible weight transferred from father to son. Yet Pierre also recognized the gift in it. Austin was entrusting him not just with the family secret, but with the possibility of redemption, of breaking the cycle of guilt that had claimed 2 generations already. "I'll need to know more," Pierre said finally. "Everything you can tell me about grandfather, about Parkerville, about the bank where he worked. If I'm going to make this right, I need the complete picture." Austin nodded, relief evident in his features. "I've put together what I know," he said, indicating a folder among the papers spread before him. "It's not much. Newspaper clippings, letters, notes from conversations with my mother when her guard was down. But it's a start. The rest," he gestured vaguely, "the rest you'll have to discover for yourself." As evening fell, Pierre sat alone on the porch swing, watching darkness settle over the farm that wasn't truly his ancestral home, yet was the only home he had ever known. The revelations of the day had altered his perception of everything: the land, the house, even his own reflection glimpsed in the window glass. He was Pierre Jackson by upbringing and documentation, but Pierre Keller by blood and inheritance. The duality created a strange dissonance, as if he were simultaneously 2 people occupying the same space. Yet amid this identity crisis came an unexpected clarity. For years he had felt a nameless discomfort, a sense of something not quite right about his place in the world. Now he understood that feeling for what it was: the unconscious recognition of a fundamental untruth at the core of his existence. Inside the house, Austin had retreated to his bedroom early, exhausted by the emotional toll of their conversations. Pierre remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the Indiana countryside: crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through dry cornstalks. Tomorrow he would need to make decisions: whether to stay longer at the farm or return to his life in Detroit, whether to dig deeper into the Keller history or let sleeping secrets lie, whether to continue calling himself Jackson or to reclaim the name that had been his birthright. But tonight he allowed himself simply to exist in the knowledge, to feel its weight and texture, to begin the process of incorporating this new understanding into his sense of self. The truth, however painful, was preferable to the half-life of unknowing he had lived until now. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first true frost of autumn silvering the fields and rooftops. Pierre rose early and found himself drawn once again to the family cemetery, this time with new eyes. He stood before his grandparents' graves, Edmund and Elizabeth Jackson, seeing beyond the fabricated surname to the complicated people beneath. Not monsters, despite their deception, but flawed human beings who had made a desperate choice and lived with its consequences. The unmarked stone in the corner seemed to call to him, and he knelt beside it, brushing away dead leaves that had accumulated around its base. "I don't know if anyone is actually missing," he said quietly, addressing whatever ghost might linger. "But if you're out there, know that you haven't been forgotten. Your absence has shaped this family as surely as any presence could." Upon returning to the house, Pierre found his father at the kitchen table, a road map of Indiana spread before him, certain locations circled in red pencil. "Parkerville," Austin explained, pointing to one of the circles, "and this is where the bank was. The First National Bank of Parkerville gone now, consolidated with a larger institution in the 30s. This spot here is where our house stood, according to county records." His finger traced a route between the locations. "About an hour's drive if you're planning to go." Pierre nodded, studying the map. "I need to see it. Even if there's nothing left, I need to stand where it all began." Austin folded the map carefully and handed it to his son. "Take my truck. Keys are on the hook by the door." "And Pierre," he hesitated, then finished simply, "be careful, the past has teeth." Whoa. The drive to Parkerville took Pierre through rolling farmland, interrupted occasionally by small towns that seemed frozen in time, untouched by the rapid modernization reshaping America's larger cities. Parkerville itself proved to be even smaller than Millfield. A handful of streets clustered around a modest town square, dominated by a red-brick courthouse. Following his father's map, Pierre located the site where the First National Bank had once stood, now occupied by a drugstore with a lunch counter visible through plate glass windows. He parked across the street and sat for a moment, trying to imagine his grandfather as a young bank clerk, methodically planning whatever financial crime had necessitated his eventual flight and reinvention. The location of the original Keller home proved more difficult to find, the rural roads having been renumbered and rerouted in the decades since his family had lived there. After several wrong turns, Pierre finally found what he believed to be the correct property, a fallow field with a stand of oak trees at its far edge, no visible foundation or other evidence that a house had ever stood there. As he walked across the frost-hardened ground, he felt a strange sense of disconnection, as if he were moving through a dream landscape. This anonymous patch of Indiana soil was where his family's tragic trajectory had begun, yet it held no resonance, offered no epiphanies, just empty land, reclaimed by nature, indifferent to the human dramas that had unfolded upon it. Disappointed but not surprised by the lack of physical evidence, Pierre decided to try another approach. The Parkerville Public Library occupied a corner of the town square, a modest brick building with Carnegie inscribed above its entrance. Inside, Pierre found a small local history section and, more importantly, bound archives of the Parkerville Gazette, dating back to the early 1900s. With the assistance of a helpful librarian who seemed delighted by this unusual interest in local history, he began searching the editions from 1919 and early 1920, looking for any mention of the Keller family or irregularities at the town bank. His persistence was rewarded when he discovered a small article dated January 10, 1920. Local bank reports discrepancy in accounts. Officials at First National Bank of Parkerville have confirmed that an internal audit has revealed financial irregularities. While no formal accusations have been made, sources indicate that several employees are being questioned. Bank President Harrison Wells assures depositors that their funds remain secure and that the discrepancy appears limited to the bank's operating accounts rather than customer deposits. Pierre read the article twice, his heart racing. Harrison Wells, not a colleague as his father had assumed, but the bank president himself, and the name matched. This must be the Harrison who had been blackmailing his grandfather. Further searching yielded a follow-up story from February 2, 1920. Bank clerk resigns amid ongoing investigation. Edmund Keller, employed as senior accounts clerk at First National Bank, has tendered his resignation effective immediately, citing family matters. Bank President Harrison Wells declined to comment on whether Keller's departure is connected to the ongoing investigation into accounting discrepancies reported last month. Keller and his family are said to be relocating due to Mrs. Keller's health concerns. The carefully worded article revealed nothing explicitly damning, but Pierre could read between the lines. His grandfather had resigned just weeks before the fire that would complete his transformation into Edmund Jackson. The most revealing article came from March 15, 1920, buried on page 4. Investigation closed in bank discrepancy case. First National Bank of Parkerville has concluded its investigation into financial irregularities discovered earlier this year. Bank President Harrison Wells stated that the missing funds, totaling approximately $3,700, have been accounted for as a clerical error rather than deliberate misappropriation. No charges will be filed. We consider the matter resolved and look forward to restoring our customers' complete confidence, Wells said in a prepared statement. Pierre did some quick mental calculation. $3,700 in 1920 would be equivalent to perhaps $30,000 or more in current value, a substantial sum that aligned with the amount his father had described as remaining after the purchase of the Jackson farm. But something about the story didn't add up. If his grandfather had indeed stolen the money, why would Harrison Wells, the apparent victim of the theft, close the investigation and declare it a mere clerical error? Unless Pierre felt a chill as a new possibility emerged. What if his grandfather hadn't been the thief, but the scapegoat? What if Harrison Wells himself had been the one to embezzle the funds, then used his position to direct suspicion toward Edmund Keller? It would explain why Wells had been blackmailing his grandfather, threatening exposure of some evidence that would incriminate Edmund despite his innocence. And it would explain why, after the fire destroyed whatever evidence existed, Wells had quickly closed the case, declaring it an error rather than risking further investigation. With this new theory burning in his mind, Pierre expanded his search, looking for any information on Harrison Wells beyond the bank scandal. He found the man's obituary from April 1932, which painted the picture of a respected community leader who had guided the bank through the difficult early years of the Depression before succumbing to heart failure at age 58. The obituary mentioned that Wells was survived by a sister, Meredith Wells of Chicago, but no other immediate family. Pierre made careful notes of all these details, including the sister's name, which corresponded with Austin's account of who had notified his grandfather of Wells' death. By late afternoon, Pierre had compiled a substantial dossier on the events of 1919-1920 from public records, significantly expanding the skeletal account his father had provided. As he drove back to the Jackson farm, his mind worked furiously, connecting dots and formulating a narrative that made increasing sense. His grandfather had discovered evidence of Harrison Wells' embezzlement, perhaps accidentally, and been forced into a terrible choice: remain silent and accept payments for his complicity, or report the crime and risk being framed as the perpetrator by the more powerful man. The arrangement had become untenable over time, leading to the desperate solution of faking a complete break with their past through fire and identity theft. When Pierre arrived back at the farm, he found his father waiting anxiously on the porch, rising stiffly as the truck pulled into the yard. "Did you find anything?" Austin asked as Pierre approached, his expression a mixture of hope and dread. "Quite a bit, actually," Pierre replied, gesturing with the folder of notes and photocopies he'd accumulated. "I think I understand what really happened now, and it's not exactly what you believed all these years." Inside, at the kitchen table, Pierre laid out his findings chronologically, walking his father through the newspaper accounts and the alternative interpretation they suggested when read with a critical eye. "So, you're saying my father wasn't the thief but the witness?" Austin asked, his voice trembling slightly as decades of assumed family shame were suddenly called into question. "That this bank president Wells was the one who stole the money, then blackmailed grandfather to keep him silent?" Pierre nodded, pointing to the final article about the investigation being closed. It explains why Wells would declare it a clerical error once the evidence was destroyed in the fire. He got away with the theft and no longer had to fear exposure from whatever papers grandfather possessed. Austin sat back in his chair, his face a study in conflicting emotions. Relief warring with anger at the injustice, sorrow for his parents' unnecessary suffering, bewilderment at how thoroughly he had misunderstood his own family history. "But the fire," Austin said after a long silence. "The possibility that someone died." Pierre had been considering this aspect as well. "I have a theory about that too. What if it was Wells himself who was in the house that night? Not Harrison Wells in person, that wouldn't make sense given that he lived on to run the bank for years afterward. But what if he had sent someone to search for the incriminating papers while grandfather was setting up the fire? A hired man, perhaps, or some unfortunate person who owed him a favor. It would explain the voice grandfather heard and why no local person was reported missing afterward. Austin considered this, then nodded slowly. "It fits. My father never knew who might have been in the house. That was part of his torment. But if it was someone connected to Wells, someone from outside the community..." The pieces continued to fall into place as father and son talked into the evening, reconstructing a family history that had been fragmented and distorted by secrets, assumptions, and half-truths passed down through generations. "There's one more thing I don't understand," Pierre said as their conversation wound down. "Why did grandfather keep the money? If he wasn't the thief, why not return it or give it away?" Austin shook his head, looking suddenly older and more tired. "I've asked myself the same question since you showed me those newspaper articles. The only answer I can think of is that he felt he'd earned it in a way, compensation for being forced to abandon his name, his home, his entire identity. Or maybe he intended to return it someday, but never found a way to do so without exposing himself. Whatever his reasoning, that money became a curse for him, a constant reminder of what had been lost." The next morning, Pierre made a decision. After breakfast, he gathered the old banknotes from their hiding place and laid them on the kitchen table before his father. "I know what needs to be done with this," he said with quiet certainty. "Not returning it to the bank. As you said, too much time has passed, and the institution itself doesn't even exist anymore. But there's a better use for it." He explained his plan. The money would be donated anonymously to the Parkerville Public Library for the establishment of a local history archive, ensuring that the town's past, including the true story of Harrison Wells and Edmund Keller, would be preserved for future generations. "It's a kind of justice," Pierre concluded. "Not perfect, but the best we can manage after all this time." Austin's eyes filled with tears, the first Pierre had seen from his stoic father in many years. "Your grandfather would approve, I think," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Using Wells's own stolen money to preserve the truth he tried to bury." He reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand briefly. "You're a good man, Pierre, better than I've been. I let this secret poison me, make me distant when I should have been close. I was so afraid that our family was fundamentally broken, tainted by my father's supposed crime, that I couldn't allow myself to fully embrace even my own son. Can you forgive an old man for such a terrible mistake?" Pierre felt a lifetime of distance between them suddenly collapse, years of misunderstanding giving way to a new clarity. "There's nothing to forgive," he said gently. "You did what you thought was right with the information you had. We all make the best choices we can with what we know at the time." He paused, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind since his discoveries in Parkerville. "I've been thinking about our name, about reclaiming Keller. Not legally, perhaps, that would raise too many questions, but privately between us, acknowledging who we really are." Austin nodded slowly, a weight visibly lifting from his shoulders. "I'd like that. After all these years hiding from a shame that was never truly ours. Yes, I'd like to be Austin Keller again, at least in my own heart." In the days that followed, Pierre arranged the anonymous donation through a lawyer in Indianapolis, ensuring that the money would reach the Parkerville Library with instructions for its use, but no indication of its source. He also extended his stay at the farm, working alongside his father to repair the sagging barn roof and clear the overgrown fields. physical labor that provided a backdrop for deeper healing as they shared stories and memories, gradually bridging the emotional gap that had separated them for so long. The unmarked stone in the family cemetery became a focus for their reconciliation with the past. Together they cleaned it thoroughly and, after much discussion, added a simple inscription: "For those lost in the fire, remembered at last." As autumn deepened toward winter, Pierre finally prepared to return to Detroit, his understanding of himself fundamentally transformed by what he had learned and the connections he had restored. On his last evening at the farm, he and Austin sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset over fields that now felt genuinely like a shared inheritance rather than a monument to deception. "Will you tell people about our real name, our real history?" Austin asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Pierre considered the question carefully before answering. "Not widely. The truth belongs primarily to us, I think, but I won't hide it either if the question arises. And someday, if I have children of my own, they'll know the full story from the beginning. No secrets, no shame, just a family history with all its complexities and contradictions." Austin smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face, erasing years of worry and guilt. "I'd like that. Grandchildren who know themselves as Kellers in spirit, if not on paper. Who can carry forward the good parts of our legacy without the burden we bore for so long?" He gazed out at the darkening landscape, his voice growing reflective. "You know, for all the pain this secret caused, there's something almost miraculous about how it's ended. Not with more deception, but with truth. Not with shame, but with understanding." Pierre nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. The macabre origin of the Jackson family had finally been brought into the light, examined and reinterpreted. What had begun as a desperate flight from perceived guilt had generations later evolved into a journey toward reconciliation and redemption, not through denial of the past, but through its complete acceptance. As stars began to appear in the clear Indiana sky, Pierre thought about the road ahead. He would return to his life in Detroit, to his work as a mechanic and the friends he had made there. But he would return changed, carrying with him a more complete understanding of his identity and his place in the world. He would visit the farm more often now, maintaining the connection with his father that had been so painfully attenuated for most of his life. And someday, when Austin was gone, he would decide whether to keep the Jackson farm or sell it. But either way, he would do so with full knowledge of its significance in his family's complex history. The cycle of secrecy had been broken, the burden of unearned guilt finally set down. Whatever the future held for Pierre Keller, who lived as Pierre Jackson, it would be built on a foundation of truth rather than deception, and in that truth lay the possibility of genuine redemption, not just for himself, but for all the generations of his family, past and future.